Now, just to look at the names of the last three Prakim, because I want you to see the interrelationship. Perek Vav, as you know, is called HaHefresh Bein HaChassid HaMe'ula Ubein HaKovesh Es Yitzro VaMoshel Benafsho. That means the distinction between the highest level of piety, of Chasidus, who does not desire bad, he only desires good, versus the one who conquers his Yetzer Hara and he rules over his nefesh, right? So that's the thing we were talking about the past 2 days. Perek Vav, Perek Zayin, is called Mechitza. Now, Mechitza here does not mean the separation of men and women. That's not the issue that he's talking about. But Mechitza means the walls that separate man from God. There are walls. They're spiritual barriers that separate me from being connected to Hashem. I'll come back to that in a moment. And Perek Ches, the last of the 8 Prakim, of course, in Shmona Prakim, is called Yetzira Anushit, the nature of the human being, the nature of the creation of man. Now, and essentially Perek Ches, actually I would have called it something, basically it's about Bechira, it's about free will. So we could basically say that the 3 last chapters, number 1, the distinction between desiring good and conquering my desire for evil. Then we have Mechitza, and then we have Bechira. Now I hope you see that all of these are connected, because number 1, in Perek Vav, the Rambam did establish that when it comes to matters of midos, it is not enough rather, to do the right thing. You have to feel the right thing, meaning to say, if I give charity to the poor, but I don't feel compassion, I don't feel rachamim, I don't feel care or concern, that is a chisara. And even though behaviorally I'm behaving the same way. And by the way, this has manifestations in other areas as well. For example, let's assume you read about tragedies that are happening in other parts of the world. And maybe they involve Jews, or maybe they involve non-Jews. Earthquakes, tsunamis, war, famine, disease. Random acts of violence, school shootings, which is apparently the weekly event in the United States, and the like. So how should I relate to it? Now, from an action ethic standpoint, one might say, listen, nothing I can do about it. It's not my country, not my people. All right, maybe I'll send money if they need money for whatever reason. But what is the point of commiserating with suffering over which I have nothing to do? I have no way of alleviating that suffering and the like. So from an action perspective, one might say, why should I even have it in my radar? But if you understand that fakert, the purpose of good midos is not for good action. It goes the other way around. The purpose of good action is for good midos. And what you need are midos tovos. Then fakert, whether or not I can do something about whatever is going on, is of secondary importance. I have to strive to develop the attribute of chesed, of chanina, of rachamim, of nosei biol. Now this is besides the mystical idea. There is a mystical idea, which is not necessarily rational, that if I bear the sufferings of other people, that does make it easier for them, that even if they're not aware of it, I share in their sufferings. At that point, I'm actually doing something for them. But according to the Rambam, it goes beyond that. Even if, in fact, I'm doing nothing for them, but part of my shleimus is to be margish, rachamim. So even if it's nothing to do with me. Now they say, for example, the altar of Slobodka. Slobodka is in Lithuania. Still around. The city's around. Slobodka is a suburb of Kovna, which in Lithuanian, Kaunas, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is still a big city in Lithuania. So some of the roads were built by prison labor, like prisoners. Prisoners build roads. That's one of the things they do. And one can imagine that the prisons in those days were not like the federal prisons. Not that I recommend anyone should go to prison, but a federal prison, at least a federal prison, is not the worst place to be. You're generally with white-collar people, lawyers, doctors, accountants. You're kind of a high-class clientele, cable TV, other things. Although it's not as good if you're going to go to jail. Forgive the digression for a moment. Do it in Scandinavia. That's really this was unbelievable. They have open dormitories. You go to work in the day. You get a car. You come back. You just got to report. In. And you're basically like living. I mean, it's much more comfortable than Ohr Somayach. I mean, So if for whatever reason you need to go to prison, do it in Scandinavia. You'll be that's the good place. But be it as it may, the prisons in Europe at the time, late 19th, early 20th century, were not really like the federal prisons of today, and the Alter Slobodka physically could not travel or walk on the roads that were built by prison labor. He basically said, how can I enjoy that which came from so much suffering and so much punishment and so much torture? How can I do that? How can I benefit from that? And this may even translate, I don't want to get political, this may even translate in terms of contemporary buying habits. Should you buy stuff that was produced by inhumane child labor? Now you might say, what's the difference? I'm not advocating a particular position. I'm just saying, but a person might say, what's the difference? I buy, I don't buy. That's not going to change what they're doing in China. But according to the Rambam, there's another point here. It's not changing what they're doing in China. It's developing within yourself a certain sensitivity to human suffering and compassion. So that was the thesis of Perek Vav, right? The thesis of Perek Vav is when it comes to midos, although it is a high madrega to control your negativities and behave appropriately, but the chassid, hama'ula, transforms his midos as well. Now, what Perek Zion is going to do, mechitza, is actually going to explain why that's important. Meaning you might ask the question, I've already said it a number of times, why is it important? As long as I'm doing the right thing, what's the difference what I feel inside? I'm doing the right thing. So this is where the Rambam introduces the notion, which again, we've said it many times, so you've heard it already, but this is where the Rambam develops it in its fullest expression, that when there are midos in your nefesh that are negative, and you don't have the optimal good midos, they become barriers or walls in your ability to connect to God. And since we actually read in Perek that the tachlis, the purpose of our lives, is to create a conscious connection to God, then by definition, anything that's an impediment to that tachlis, remember, everything's interrelated. Remember Perek, to go back to Perek, that was what we call the purpose-driven life, that every decision you make in life has to be measured whether it advances you in your goal or it doesn't advance you. And we talked about that. That could even include recreation and basketball and jogging and vacations. As long as you do it with the kavana that this will give me energy, peace of mind, serenity, physical health, emotional stability. But you measure it, is this bringing me to my goal or is it taking me away from my goal? That's what Perek establishes. Perek Vav talks about the importance of midos. Perek Zion, in turn, connects it to Perek that you got to fix your midos because that is how you will achieve your purpose. Right? Perek says everything has to be measured, whether it achieves your purpose. Well, Perek Zion says, if I don't perfect my midos, I will not be able to achieve my purpose. My purpose, again, it's a strange thing to say a little bit, and I'm not sure if every Rishon would agree with it. The purpose of my life is not be etzem, to do good things. The purpose of my life is to connect to Hashem. But to connect to Hashem, I have to remove the mechitzos. And that requires perfection of my midos. Okay, and this is what the Rambam is going, and now Perek Ches, the final aspect of this is that this presupposes free will. Because without free will, you're just stuck wherever you are. So this whole thing would be an academic exercise. How could I talk about improving yourself if whatever you are is predetermined? So as a result, the ultimate enabler of all of these positive transformations is free will, which is going to be the last and longest chapter of the Shmona Prakim, where the Rambam will develop many of the ideas that you've heard before and learned before, but this is where they come from, the idea of free will, right? So this is a very kind of elegant composition here, because all of the different ideas flow into each other. You have to live your life towards a purpose. The purpose is connection to God. If you don't have good midos, even if you're kovesh es yitzro, you have a mechitza in that connection to God. Therefore, it behooves you to remove the mechitza to achieve your purpose. But in order to remove the mechitza, this presupposes bechira, and therefore the Rambam will address the whole issue of free will. In the Rambam's time, this was a very, very live issue, and in point of fact, one of the reasons why the Rambam stresses bechira, and bechira was a topic very fond to his heart. I mean, he addresses it in the Shmona Prakim at length, and in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide to the Perplexed, and in the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchos Tshuva. The Rambam talks about bechira. Because if you think about it, why is bechira connected to tshuva? Bechira is connected to tshuva for two different reasons. Number one, if I wouldn't have bechira, I would have no reason to do tshuva. Why do I have to do tshuva if I'm pre-programmed to behave a certain way? Number two, if you didn't believe in bechira, I wouldn't be able to do tshuva. So free will is both the reason why I must do tshuva, and it's the reason why I can do tshuva. You see, if you take away free will, there's no need to do tshuva, and there's no ability to do tshuva. Free will brings both of those ideas into existence at the same time. So I just want to point out that the Rambam was addressing a very live controversy, historically, a very live controversy that was existing during his time. The Rambam was very, very conversant with other Islamic philosophers, some of whom were not Jewish. In fact, I think I mentioned to you a long time ago that the Rambam, for a very short time, before he was a doctor, when he needed to make a parnasa, he was actually I'm not sure how the universities worked in those days, but there was some type of university structure. He was an instructor in philosophy at an Islamic university, whatever that meant exactly. Now, it wasn't a university as we know it, but the Rambam taught general Aristotelian philosophy as expounded by various Arabic philosophers. Again, not with an Islamic religious content, but in terms of metaphysics and the like. And there was within Islam a group that were called the Mudakalimun, I think I pronounced it correctly, the Mudakalimun, who believed that free will was impossible in light of God's omnipotence, meaning God is all-powerful. God directs everything that happens in the world. There is nothing, the universe, there is nothing that can be done without God directing it, right? This is a religious belief. I mean, we believe that also. But so they basically argued, therefore, to say that a human being has free will is an impossibility, because that would be indicating that there's something in the world that is beyond God's control and God's direction. And as a result, the Muda Kalamun concluded that free will is simply an illusion that God allows human beings to have, but in point of fact, God dictates every action or inaction that you will take or not take. Now, the Rambam will address this question. We're not doing Perek Ches today, so we'll hold off till we get to it. But one of the reasons why the Rambam reaffirms over and over and over and over again the idea of bechira is because the ideas of the Muda Kalamun were penetrating not only Islam, but were penetrating Judaism as well. Because at first glance, it sounds like a very frum idea. There's God, and there's only God, and God controls everything. Right? Sounds good. I mean, sounds frum. Hashem hu Elokim. But the Muda Kalamun were using it to basically say free will is an illusion. It is false. It doesn't exist. And that, the Rambam correctly notes, is against the whole philosophy of the Torah. It undermines the capacity for tshuva, for change, for growth. Everything is predetermined, just as centuries later, this was the doctrine of the Calvinists, right? John Calvin, Geneva, one of the Protestant movements, had a very strong view of predetermination. God determines which people are going to be the saved people, and there's nothing you can do about it. Kind of a little strange religion, but there's nothing you can do about it one way or the other. And if you behave virtuously, that just shows you are those that God has chosen. Okay, a little bit strange, but okay. But be it as it may, therefore, the point I'm making is that Perek Ches is the logical conclusion of this whole idea of perfecting your midos, because it is only free will that enables that phenomenon to happen. Okay? So if you think about all the different chapters, how they fit in, they fit in into a very logical, coherent mosaic. Perhaps the thing that's a little bit jarring is the Rambam's seeming idea that the purpose of action is midos rather than the purpose of midos is action. I do think that's a bit of I know I've repeated this many times, but it just hits me as a little bit of a reversal, that it is the midah that is more important than the action, and the purpose of the action is to give you the midos, to remove the mechitza, to connect you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That, I think, is a very, very big chiddush, but once you accept that chiddush, all the pieces fall in a very, very logical way. So now let's look a little bit at Perek Zayin. And Perek Zayin, again, the Rambam introduces the idea of mechitza, and he says that a person might have one mechitza, many mechitzas, a million mechitzas, and what measures the madrega of how great a navi is. Now, obviously, a person that's a navi is very close to God. They're so close to God that they're communicating with God, or God's communicating with them. But we do know that Nevi'im themselves have different madregos of Nevuah. And Chazal use a lashon that all the Nevi'im perceived Hashem biaspaklaria she'ena me'ira. Through a glass, aspaklaria is a lens, she'ena me'ira, that is opaque, that's not fully clear. Moshe Rabbeinu perceived Hashem through an aspaklaria me'ira. Right, the phrase that I am not sure, I think appears in the Christian Bible, through a lens darkly, is really, that's the translation, that phrase, through a lens darkly, is simply a translation of the rabbinic mimer, aspaklaria she'ena me'ira, through a dark lens. So the Rambam explains what this means. Chazal don't mean there's glass or a lens or anything, but this refers to mechitzas. All the Nevi'im, although they didn't have solid walls, their walls weren't solid, their walls were glass. But the glass was tinted, the glass was dark, they didn't fully get clarity. Moshe Rabbeinu perfected himself to such a madrega that he could perceive Hashem through aspaklaria me'ira. Now, the Rambam points out that even Moshe Rabbeinu did have a barrier, because after all, it doesn't say Moshe Rabbeinu perceived Hashem without any lens at all. There was a lens, but it was relatively clearer than the other ones. And the Rambam says Moshe Rabbeinu only had one mechitza, and the one mechitza he had was the fact that he had a body, that the spiritual essence of a person cannot ever perceive Hashem at 100% level, as long as it is encased in the limitations of the body. And this was the last mechitza that Moshe Rabbeinu had, because he perfected himself in every other way. Now, l'chaira, what bothers me here a little bit is, isn't this a contradiction to what the Rambam said at the end of Perek K? Remember, at the end of Perek Dalet. If you remember, at the end of Perek Dalet, the Rambam was discussing what was Moshe Rabbeinu's sin by the waters of strife, the Mei Meriva, where Hashem decreed that Moshe Rabbeinu will not be allowed to enter Eretz Yisrael. And unlike Rashi, who says Moshe Rabbeinu's sin was hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, the Rambam didn't learn that way. The Rambam says there was no sin in hitting the rock. God told him to take the stick, and that meant to hit the rock. But you'll remember, the sin was that Moshe Rabbeinu exhibited the midah of anger by calling them rebellious ones. Now, l'chaira, I mean, how can you say both ways? You're telling me Moshe Rabbeinu reached the highest level of perfection, that the only mechitza that divided him from God was the mechitza of the body. Well, l'chaira, there was at least a shemetz, a tiny little bit of something. Lefi his madrega. Doesn't mean he had a bad temper. It doesn't mean, God forbid, he was always angry. Of course that wasn't the case. But there was something there. There was a cancer cell of anger in there that came out at a certain point. So l'chaira, it seems to be a little bit of a contradiction. I mean, you could still say that Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest of all Nevi'im, but I'm not sure if you could say he was totally perfect, except for the fact that he was in a body, given the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had a chet. Okay, so that's a little bit of an inconsistency. But this is the point that he makes about Moshe Rabbeinu perfecting himself and not having any mechitzas. Now, there is an interesting medrash. Well, not a medrash. It's quoted as a medrash that the Tiferes Yisrael brings in Pirkei Avos. Tiferes Yisrael is a great commentary on the Mishnah, written by Rav Yisrael Lipschitz in the 19th century. That's the Yochanu Boaz, right? If you look at a big Mishnayos with commentaries, with Mefarshim, you will find the Bartanura, which is like the Rashi of the Mishnah, and the Tosfos Yom Tov, who was a student of the Maharal of Prague, Tosfos Yom Tov, and then at the bottom there'll be Tiferes Yisrael, which has two parts. One is like a Pshat commentary, and the other is more of a pilpul. Yachin uBoaz. Yachin is the Pshat commentary, Boaz is the pilpul commentary. It's one of the great commentaries, but Rav Yisrael Lipschitz often digresses into other things as well. So in his commentary to Pirkei Avos, he brings the following story b'shem the Medrash. And the Medrash goes that in the 19th century, they used to have a thing called physiognomy. That means you look at the bumps on a person's skull, and that kind of tells you what type of person he is. So the story goes that when Moshe Rabbeinu started doing makos and all sorts of things, Paro was curious, what type of person is this Moshe Rabbeinu? So he had a painting made of Moshe Rabbeinu, an exact painting with all the bumps and whatever it would be. And Paro had his chachamim look at the painting, and they determined that this man is a rasha. This man is full of selfishness and egotism and anger and bad midos. There's no way a man with that physical skull shape, facial shape, could be righteous. So at some point, when Paro encountered Moshe, he says, all my chachamim tell me, you're an evil man. You're full of bad midos. How could this be? And Moshe Rabbeinu is said to have responded, it is true that I was born with all the bad midos, but I worked on myself. Now again though, he worked on himself not in the sense of being kovesh the Yetzer. He worked on himself to make the midos good. I mean, this is not a stira, right? And I worked on myself and I worked in myself till I perfected my midos. And the Tiferes Yisrael uses that medrash, I put it in quotation marks in a moment, you'll see why, to show the idea of bechira, that no matter what your midos are, you can work on yourself, you can improve, you can grow. Right? And the Rambam would agree with that, of course. The big problem is there is no such medrash. There is no such medrash at all. What happened was that in the Middle Ages, there began to be collections of folk stories that Jewish writers put in, and they would often just call it a medrash. And some of those folk stories in later generations became accepted as midrashim, even though they are not from Chazal. So this story actually does not appear in Chazal. And in point of fact, there are many, many makoros that contradict this Chazal. This idea that Moshe was born with bad midos and he perfected himself is contradicted by the teaching of Chazal, that when Rabbeinu was born, the whole house filled with light. And Moshe Rabbeinu as a baby would not nurse from a non-Jewish woman, etc. So it's very, very clear that at least in the mainstream of Chazal, Moshe Rabbeinu was born with an extremely exalted soul. And the Tiferes Yisrael was working off a second-hand source that called it a medrash. In fact, there is no medrash to that effect. And indeed, in some of the more modern reprintings of Tiferes Yisrael, you might not be able to find this. They took it out. They took it out as a result. But they censor sometimes, because Tiferes Yisrael has another essay about dinosaurs and evolution and age of the earth, in which he actually said all of this can work, all of this can be reconciled, because there were prior worlds to this one, and therefore even if this world is only 57, well, whatever it was, in his time 56, 50, whatever it was, but there were prior worlds and the dinosaurs could belong to those prior worlds. Tiferes Yisrael says this. He's a very, very accepted parish. But in some of the newer editions, they pulled it out. They did some censorship because they thought that was too controversial for the firm world. I mean, frankly, that's absolutely outrageous. I mean, it's one thing if he made a mistake. He quoted a medrash that wasn't a medrash. Even then, I would not be in favor of censorship. What I would have liked to see is let there be a footnote that says we have not found this in a medrash, but there are books that Jews have that give you that story. Even then, I'm not in favor of censorship. But okay, but you could say if it's a mistake, take it out. But if a Gadol b'Yisrael expresses a shita, didn't make a mistake. This was his shita. This was his shita to simply say we don't want our students to be exposed to it. Let's take it out. I mean, you're not censoring, Darwin or some secular book. You're censoring a Gadol, and so that's a big problem with censorship. There are other examples too I can give you. Another example of a very beloved medrash. I've heard people say this. Maybe I shouldn't tell you. They say this is their favorite medrash. Their favorite medrash that they love, and it absolutely is not a medrash. It is actually a German folktale that got turned into a medrash. And I've heard people tell me this is their favorite medrash. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't want to be mean. But I'll tell you this, a famous story about why did Hashem choose the HaRav to be the site of the Beis HaMikdash. So the story goes because there were two brothers, and one brother was very wealthy and had no children, and the other brother had many children, but was very poor. And basically it was each person at the Temple Mount, at that site, one was willing to give some of his children so his brother could raise them, and one was willing to give up all of his money to the brother with the children. And the place where each one showed love and selfless devotion to the other, that's the place that Hashem's Shekhinah is going to rest. A beautiful story, and certainly the machshava is 100% true. The machshava, that the love that Jews have for each other brings God into the world, that's certainly a very important thought. And indeed, when we contemplate the fact that the Chorban Beis HaMikdash came because of sinas chinam, this is a thought we should think about. But as an exact story, it happens not to be true, because it is not a medrash. Its origin is a German folktale in the 19th century that once again some author picks up and calls it a calls it a medrash. So you got to be careful sometimes that when midrashim are quoted in an extreme case, they are not even Jewish sources. In less extreme cases, sometimes they're from the Gaonim or the Rishonim, so they're still Torah teachings, but they're not from Chazal proper. So that's why it is good that when Mechabrim bring midrashim, they should try to go back to a midrashic source to be able to indicate where it's from. Medrash Rabbah, Medrash Tanchuma. Actually, maybe I'm speaking against my own interest because people are often ask me, where's the medrash? And I sometimes have trouble finding it, so maybe I shouldn't put myself in that situation. But the truth is, there is a justification to try to see every medrash inside to be sure that it exists and it's not being misquoted. But be it as it may, the Rambam does talk about the idea of mechitza, and in fact, he offers a very beautiful mechudishtika interpretation of a Maimer Chazal. And this is mamish a chiddush of the Rambam, very fascinating chiddush. The Gemara says in Maseches Nedarim, Ein ha-nevuah shayra ela al chacham gibor v'ashir. Nevuah can only rest on a person if he has achieved chachma, wisdom, gibor, strength, ashir, and wealth. Now, the simple meaning of this Gemara is a little difficult. Okay, chachma, I understand. Wisdom, understanding, Torah, okay. But, like, you got to be strong. Well, the guy has to be a bodybuilder. Got to be rich. Why would physical strength and wealth be conditions to be a Navi? One would not assume that. So here's the Rambam's fascinating, nice chiddush. The Rambam says that the meaning of the Gemara in Nedarim has to be connected to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah in Perek of Pirkei Avos says, Ezeu Chacham. Who is a Chacham? Halomed mikol adam, one who is humble enough to learn from everybody. Ezeu Gibor. Hakovesh es Yitzro. He conquers the Yetzer Hara. Ezeu Asher Hasomayach B'chelka. He is happy with his lot. So listen to this. So according to this, the Rambam says, Chacham, Gibor, and Asher are not three different qualities. Wisdom, physical strength, and wealth. They are all referring to midos. Chacham is the humility of being willing and able to learn from everybody. That's a midah. That's a midah of anava. Now, Gibor, now here's a little bit of attention. Gibor is to be kovesh, the Yetzer Hara. But isn't that a contradiction to Perek Vav, where you're not supposed to be kovesh? But the answer is, he was kovesh his Yetzer Hara and then graduated to perfecting his midos that way. And similarly, Asher means he is grateful and content with what God has given him. It's a very nice chiddush. In other words, the Gemara doesn't mean a Navi has to be rich. There's no reason why a Navi has to be rich. But part of midos is being Somayach B'chelkai. Right, so that's the Rambam's interpretation, that Nevuah, which is the maximum of your connection with God, requires perfection both in what is called malos sichlios, intellectual attainments, and malos hamidos, attainments of character and midos tovos. And that's why Chazal do say when a person is angry, he will lose his nevuah. So even though Moshe was generally not angry, but in the moments of his anger, the Shekhinah is nistalek from him, because all of these are considered to be mechitzas. Okay, so this is what Moshe Rabbeinu asked us. And Moshe Rabbeinu saw Hashem perceived Hashem. It means saw Hashem does not mean sees an image, but he perceives Hashem through aspaklaria hameira. Aspaklaria hameira. So if you remember, when he was after the Chet Egel, when he is praying that Hashem should forgive Bnei Yisrael, at some point he asks Hashem, Hareini na es kavodecha. Show me your glory. Very mysterious scene. And Hashem puts Moshe in the cleft of a rock, and he says, I will pass my glory before you. I will put my palm over your eyes as my glory passes. And then, when my glory passes, I will remove my hand from your eyes, and you will see me from the back, and you will not see me from the front. Very, very strange. Ki lo yirani ha'adam. No human can see me, v'chai, and live. And you remember that, at least the psukim, right? The psukim are very difficult. What was Moshe asking, and what was Hashem answering? So the Rambam says, when Moshe Rabbeinu sees that Hashem is going to forgive the Jewish people for the Chet Egel, he sees this is an Eis Ratzon. An Eis Ratzon means a time of grace. Right? You got something from God, maybe I'll get more. It's a good time. So he figured, he asked Hashem to remove the final mechitza so he could perceive God in his totality. Show me the totality of your glory. Complete Yedias Hashem. And Hashem says that's impossible. As long as you're in Adam cannot see me and live, meaning you're in a body. You're in a body, by definition, I can't show you everything, because that cannot exist in the framework of Adam, in the framework of physicality. But, the Rambam says, Hashem did grant Moshe an upgrade in perception, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu was zocheh to have a perception of God that no other human being ever had from that point on, meaning until then maybe Moshe wasn't the greatest of prophets. It's interesting, but that upgrade, and that is what Hashem means, you will see me from the back. Because the Rambam says, when I see a person from the front, I know 100%, unless you have an identical twin brother, I know 100% who you are. Right? I fully recognize you. That you are different, right? You're different than him and him and him and him and him. It's chakuk. It is engraved in my mind, your uniqueness. When I see you from the back, so I kind of know who you are. I can usually identify a person from the back, but I'm not 100% certain, right? I don't know if you ever had the experience. Sometimes you call out to somebody from the back, hey, how you doing? And turns around, and somebody you don't even know, right? It can happen. Right, so the Rambam says that's the remez here. Don't understand this in a physical sense. God has a front face and God has a back. But rather the notion is, when you see something from the front, your identification is clear, unambiguous, 100%. From the back, it's still a bechina, it's a level of aspaklaria she'ena me'ira. So even aspaklaria she'ena me'ira has levels, meaning there's only a single wall, but the wall could be more cloudy, less cloudy. As a result of Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah, Hashem made it less cloudy than it even was before, but still, lo yirani ha'adam v'chai. Now, just derech agav, just to end here, the Chasam Sofer has a different pshat in the idea of you will see me from the back, and he says that we understand Hashem, and this applies, according to the Rambam, this is a unique shakla v'tarya with Moshe. Hashem is talking to Moshe, nothing to do with us. I mean, we don't see it from the back or the front. The Chasam Sofer actually universalizes it. He makes it a thought that applies to all of us, not just Moshe Rabbeinu. And he says that the concept is that you never understand the ways of Hashem while it's happening. But when it's all over, at the end of history, at the end of time, when Mashiach comes, we will understand God in retrospect. We will understand the ways of Hashem in hindsight, even though we don't understand it as it's happening. And that's the nechama to us, that even though we live in a world of suffering and we live in a world of difficulty, but at the end of everything, we will understand it. We will see Hashem from the back, even though we don't see Hashem from the front. One other additional word on this, which is gewaldige word, I don't know who said it, but some Svarim say it, that Chazal actually say Hashem saw, Moshe Rabbeinu saw the head tefillin of Hashem and saw the knot in the back. So it's interesting. The Mekubalim say the two straps of the tefillin shel rosh is midas hadin and midas harachamim. So from the front we see din and rachamim. But when you look at tefillin in the back, you see that both straps emanate from the same place, meaning even Hashem's din is ultimately rachamim. So this universalizes the message, but again, this is not the Rambam's approach. The Rambam does not understand V'ra'isa es achorai as any message to us per se. It's a unique configuration of Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer for a higher level of complete Yediyas Hashem. And Hashem says, I'll give you more than you had before, but there will still be this bechina of aspaklaria she'ena meira.